My name is Robert Franklin, and I am conducting oral history with Edward Milliman on July 6th, 2016. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University Tri-Cities. I will be talking with Edward Milliman about his experiences working at the Hanford site and living in Richland. So I guess the first place to start is the beginning. So why don't you tell me how you came to Hanford and to Richland?
From 1960 until 67, I worked for General Electric and Douglas United Nuclear. And I got laid off in 67. So then I went to Montana, Bozeman area, ran a couple of ranches there for a couple of years. Went up a cut bank, Montana. In fact, it was Winterford, Montana. And 40 below there in the winter was nothing. And the only way you could get to town, which was 20 miles away, they would start their D8 cat up with a blade on it and blade the road all the way to town. And town was a grocery store and a tavern.
Right.
And some of them old cowboys there, they'd get snowed in all winter. And when spring thaw come, there in their hired help, they would all come into town and go into the saloon there, the bar. And I noticed every time I would go in there, one fellow was always there. If you left late at night, he was still there. And I asked the bartender, which was from Longview, Washington. He said, no, we just lock him in. He just stays here. and if he drinks anything through the night, the money's always to the side there. But anyway, that and those old cowboys would come in and they would get all drunked up. And that one guy would say, and the bartender told me, he said, see them two old fellas, and they must have been 70, 75. He said, stay away from them, just leave them alone. No matter what happens, leave them alone. Don't say anything. Pretty soon their voices started getting loud, and I started paying them some attention. And he said, that was not your calf. That was my calf that crawled through the fence, and I just pulled him back. You're a liar. And them two old fellas jumped up and went to knocking each other around and down on the floor. And they weren't kidding. They were really laying the knuckles to each other. And pretty soon the bartender took a wet bar towel on them. They got up and sat there and sopped the blood up in their nose and their lips. And they sat there having a drink, and they started laughing. And the bartender said, you know, neither one of them's ever had a calf or a cow in their life. They're wheat farmers. And he said they're just so glad to see each other. They beat the devil out of each other every year. He said this happens every spring. And pretty soon he said, now just sit still, Matt. He said, it ain't over yet. And I said, my goodness. So pretty soon he said, you hit me harder than I hit you. No, I didn't. Smack, bang, down they went again. And that finally ended it. But anyway, just some of the funny things that happened to me. Then I came back and put an application in for Battelle. And
In what?
1970. They hired me on January the 5th, 1970. I was working for a doctor, Dr. Alfred P. Weiner, which happened to be, during the war, a fighter pilot for the Germans. He joined the Luftwaffe, the Hitler Youth, and his father was SS. And he's also written a book, From Hitler Youth to United States Citizen, which I proudly have the second autographed copy. But we were doing all kind of bioassays and lifespan studies using, mainly then it was hamsters, and Syrian golden hamsters. And we were making them, and we'd put them in these exposure chambers, and they were introduced to nickel oxide in this one particular chamber. And the next chamber would be cobalt oxide. And then also we went on introduced cigarette smoke to them. You'd put them in a tube and plug them into a Hamburg 2 smoking machine, which had 30 cigarettes on this turret, and the machine would take a puff off each cigarette and blow it into this chamber, and they had no choice but to inhale it.
Wow.
And asbestos exposure. And at that time, all we had on was a lab coat and a little white paper face mask. And at that time, they didn't know the dangers of, really bad dangers of asbestos. And then in 1974, when Johnson & Johnson talcum powder exposure, and that lasted for 2 years. In the meantime, all the employees out at 100F, where we were located, they moved into the new life science laboratory here in the 3000 area. But we couldn't leave because we had animals on exposure. We weren't allowed to move them. So I was out there at 100F till 1975, 76. And then I moved into town. And I think it was 77. We went on a 2-year asbestos concrete exposure. And of course, by then, they had us pretty well suited up in fresh air and respirators and all this stuff. But then I moved over. That was over at the annex. Then I moved into the life science laboratory, which we used to say, we're stuck 1 story down in the ground in a rat-infested hole, which that all they had was rats and mice down there. And they had 4 macaque monkeys, and they were doing dental implants on them. And we had this one comrade down there that he was kind of a strange fellow. He would go into the monkey room, the macaques, and they had them in. There was 4. There was 3 males and 1 female. And if you're mean to an animal, there's no second chance or anything. If they catch you mistreating an animal, you're out the door right now. They'll escort you out, and you're finished. Well, when you went in the monkey room, these macaques, they're only set up about 2-3 foot together. And when you'd come into the room, they would hang on to the bars on their cage, and Dan would come up and smash their fingers and tell them to get back. Because they tell you, don't let them get a hold of you. They'll pull your arm out of the socket. They're that strong. And I've seen them get hold of a chain and pull a 1/2-inch eye bolt right out of the concrete. They'd put their feet against the wall. And anyway, this one male macaque, which was the dominant one there, he would turn around real fast when Dan would come in and throw his posterior up in the air, which in monkey language, that's insult, that's a challenge, come on. Anyway, Dan kept doing that and being mean to him and kicking the cage and making him get back. And I always had a safety man looking through the glass at you all the time when you'd go in there. And Dan was washing the floor out, and he got too close. And he dropped the hose, and he took a step forward to pick the hose up. And that macaque reached out and got him by the front of the coveralls and pulled him up against the cage and drew his fist back like a human. And he hit Dan so hard through the bars of that cage, he knocked him out. And the safety man run in, and all the rest of the macaques were all standing up looking, and, hey, what you doing? And they pulled Dan out and took him to first aid. Dan come back. He had the most beautiful black eye I ever seen in my life. And his nose was kind of pushed over to the side a little bit from the swelling. Our supervisor called Dan in and said, you must be careful. Don't let him get a hold of you. Okay. Well, about 2 weeks later, Dan was in there. It was his turn to go in. He was in there washing the floor out and feeding them. He got too close. That monkey reached out and got Dan by the head of the hair and Chung Kinged him into the bars and knocked him out again. Well, the safety man, he says, I run in and pulled Dan back out, and they took him to first aid. And now Dan come back, now he's got this black eye that's starting to turn green, because it's healing up. And now he's all bandaged up around his head. He got stitches in his head. The boss called him in again. Dan, you got to be careful. Stay away from them things. Okay. About 2 weeks later, Dan went in there, and to check their water, you had about a 6-inch galvanized pipe, or a 6-foot galvanized pipe. And there was a crossbar across the upright bars on the thing, and then there was a divider there. And you'd go in, you'd take that pipe, and you'd stick against the water nipple to make sure that they were getting water. This little female macaque, she would grab the pipe and poke it on there and shake her head, yes, it's okay. That's how smart they were. Well, Dan got to that big old male monkey and macaque, and he stuck the pipe in there. And the safety man told us later, he said, I knew exactly what was going to happen. Because you could sit there and see that macaque, he'd kind of sit there and think about that, watching Dan put that pipe through there and on the other cages. He grabbed the pipe, pulled it out of Dan's hand, chugged him in the belly and folded Dan over, put the pipe over the crossbar there, and romped down on the end of it, hit old Dan under the chin and knocked him out again. And the safety man, he said, I was laughing so hard I had to crawl into my hands and knees to pull Dan out of there. And here come Dan back. He still got a bandage on his head. He still got the black eye, and now he's got stitches in his chin. And the boss called Dan in and said, Dan, I'm going to have to pull you out. Them monkeys are killing you. That's just some of the humorous things that's happened there. I guess it wasn't humorous to Dan, but and we all kidded Dan so bad he left. He finally retired. And then we got after the asbestos concrete exposure, went to LSL2 down the basement, and then they got a lot of contracts from the NCI and a lot of organizations, and there were probably 8 or 10 exposure rooms in that basement, and they designed these special chambers for our inhalation studies. Dr. Owen Moss designed the chambers. And I designed a device to generate particulate matter, which I have a patent on. And there were 4 control rooms that controlled those 8 or 10 rooms. And they're using my device to generate indium phosphide. It was a component they use in computers and chips and things like that. Opening day, 2-year contract, about $25 million, and me and this other employee, we were their technician. They had finally computerized the readouts on all these chambers, and they had 1,200 rats in all these different chambers. This chamber got 10 micrograms per liter. This got 20, 30, and on down the line. There were 1,200 rats in all these different chambers. They were generating this, the delivery system. I was 200 feet away from where this stuff was being delivered to the animals. I'm sitting in the control room, all comfortable. Started that thing up and then started generating that indium phosphide. I was looking at the computer, checking the different levels in the chambers, and you had 10 minutes before T90 to get up to 100% of the target. And the other fellow asked me, he said, how's it doing? And I'm tweedling knobs and regulating the airflows and stuff, and I'm watching the computer. And the last reading I seen was it was 65% of the target. And it exploded. And it blew me and him out the door. I'm glad the door wasn't latched. It was closed, but it didn't lock. blew us into the hallway. The indium phosphide and smoke come rolling out of the ceiling. We slammed the door shut, got some tape that sealed the door. All the other technicians down the room, in the control rooms, they stuck their heads out and hollered, "Hit the panic button," which was one button on all these control rooms. When you hit the panic button, it shut everything down that they were exposing. And they broke the barrier, went out through the sterile, which cost a lot of money to clean up because that was all a sterile area. And they couldn't come my way because of the fumes and the dust. Looked in there, and it was the most beautiful violet flame. That stuff was burning. And I'm sitting there looking at it, and Buddy, he got his fresh air on and everything, run into the fire extinguisher and put fire out, and then we sealed the door again. And then they called the fire department, and they evacuated the whole building. And nobody asked us if we were okay. They would just walk up and say, "What did you do?" It blew up. Anyway, the PR people got a hold of us right away, public relations people, and they said, "You will not say anything, like an explosion or the dang thing blew up." Okay, but it did. You can't say that. And it killed all 1,200 of those rats from the concussion. And it blew out, went through the HEPA filters, went through the scrubbers, and out into the air, in which they kind of glossed over. And when I read it in the paper anyway, it said 2 scientists had previously been in the room, but no one was there when the incident happened, is the way they put it.
Wow. So I guess rolling back a little bit, or no, I guess we'll keep going and then maybe we'll roll back. So what year did that happen? The incident. This incident with what did you call it? Indium.
Indium phosphide.
Indium phosphide.
Yeah. Gosh, that must have been late 80s or early 90s, because I retired in 1996.
And you had worked for Battelle from 1970 to 1996?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And worked for the same doctor, same scientist, until the very later on, he started having some heart trouble, and he retired. And which we're still good friends. We stay in contact. Many. I think the worst exposure I was ever on was CS2. It was a tear gas with a disabler in it, and we got the contract from the Army. And even though you had protective gear on and fresh air, you would take your outside protection off. You had a pair of coveralls on underneath. If you would walk out into the hallway, everybody would shun you like you had the plague, because that stuff just stuck with you,
Mm-hmm.
And one time some got into my fresh air mask somehow, and I plugged the air in, and it gave me a full shot in the face. And down I went, and the safety man pulled me out. And they went and got a wet towel, and they had a compound that kind of nullified that stuff. It was Triton X100. And you soaked that towel in that Triton X, and I got it on my face. Of course, you don't even know where you're at. The disabler is like a bad dream. It just, your hand will fly up and slap your own face, and it just, you got no control over anything. It only lasts for a little while, but it's very effective, I can tell you. And it, gosh, it just it burns your eyes. You can't breathe. Your throat constricts, and you're disoriented. And
Do you know when this was? Do you remember when this was?
that must have been in the 80s too,
Okay.
probably the late 80s. We had so many chemical exposures going on, just one after another. And these were all lifespan studies. When they figure a rat and a mouse live a couple of years. Their lifespan is 2 years at the max. And I have a stack of papers, 8 inches high, of all the disclosure of what we were being exposed to, and we had to sign, we were aware of what the exposure would do. And there's so many chemicals like 1,3-butadiene and propylene. And next time you open a bag of Lay's potato chips or any kind of, the bags are all puffy and it look like they're plumb full. I mean, full. The last thing they shoot in that plastic bag before they seal it up is propylene, and a preservative, and all these contracts that we received were to see if they were all potential carcinogens, and we were testing the effects of them to see if they were carcinogen. And that was the main thing that I did for 26, 27 years, was it on all these inhalation exposures.
So, can you tell me about propylene? Is it a carcinogen?
I didn't get to read the report on that. They would most usually brief us after the exposure was over, and of course they'd write a scientific article about it. And I'm not sure whether it was or not. It probably was, because guys, methyl methacrylate, a lot of things they use in the carpets, 1,3-butadiene, propylene oxide, methyl methacrylate, and it just goes on and on and on. And everything that's in this room, potential carcinogen. A lot of the glues they put in the carpets and the dyes and stuff. A lot of the household cleaners, the chemicals and stuff they put in them. It's everything you do is bad. Everything you buy is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's we'll roll it back a little bit, like I mentioned. So where actually where were you born?
I was born in Washtenaw, Washington.
Oh, okay, well, that's right. And what year was that?
1938.
1938.
November 15, 1938.
And how long did you grow up in? Did you grow up in Washtenaw?
I don't even remember being there. Then my parents moved from there to Spokane, out at Moran Prairie.
Okay.
My father was a farmer, and he was also a steam engineer. And we left Spokane. He had a small farm there. We left Spokane in 1947 and moved to Benton City. And he had a farm there. He worked for the Benton County Road Department. And then, before that, they had the old prison camp out at Horn Rapids.
Mm.
And him being a steam engineer, he hired on to the Morrison Knutson construction company, and he fired the boilers for the whole complex out there at the old prison farm, the old prison place, which no prisoners there, but they'd converted into almost like a small community for the construction workers. They had all the barracks and the hutments and just like a small town there for a while. It's all gone now, but
And those were construction workers at Hanford.
Yeah,
so
and they
in
were
the late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, this was in the 50s, and most of them were working building railroads out and construction work.
And so then you went to school. So then So you said 47 you moved to Benton City.
Yeah, I started school. I started third grade in Benton City,
Okay.
and graduated in 1956.
And what did you do after you graduated?
Uh, went up and went up to Seattle, hired on for Boeing, and at the Renton plant, and we were working on the KC-135 tankers, and they had me in worked in the plumbing bays, tying down the bladders and the pumps and everything for the KC-135s. And then one day, after I was there about 2 months, the boss called and said, "Come with me." Okay. So he took me over and he said, "Now you're an electrician." And so went to school for that, and we wired up the tankers from the nose back to where they joined the wings on. And then this assembly was from the nose back to where they put the wings on, no wings yet, and they were on tracks. And they would, when it come time to move, they would just roll it down, another one would come into position, and they just, in one end out the other. And one day I happened to look over and I thought, what is that? That's not a tanker. And they said, well, that's the first commercial jets, passenger. The first 6 were Pan American, for Pan American Airlines. And we built 6 of those. And then the next one was American and Qantas and all the foreign companies. But all the 707 was at that time was a KC-135 tanker with the fuel bays taken out and the boom and everything on the back for refueling, and Boeing made a fortune off the government expense building those KC-135 tankers and doing all the design work and the engineering on them, and then they just simply made the 707 out of that tanker. And after it was there a couple of years, in one end part of the hangar, they started putting this big black shroud up from the ceiling to the floor. And the rest of the crew says, "What's going on over there?" The boss wouldn't say anything. He just, "Shut up, mind your own business." These guys started walking around in suits with the dark glasses on inside the building, sunglasses, and they were all leaning a little bit to their left. I got up close enough to look, and I said, "Oh, that guy's got a hog leg in there. He got a pistola." And they were Secret Service. And what they were doing there was building Air Force One from 707, the first one.
Wow.
They picked 6 of us, and they assigned one of those Secret Service guys to 2 people. And he would follow you wherever you went, even to the bathroom. And I would, being me, I'd tell him a joke and he'd just stare at you. The boss called us in the office. You leave those guys alone, you don't speak to them, you answer their questions, and that's all there is to it. Well, I said, well, I haven't got a sense of humor. You especially, knock it off, okay. And if you came out of that shrouded area to go to the tool room, get a tool, a pair of footsteps right behind you, and the guy said, "What are you doing? Why you need that?" Ask you all kind of questions. He'd check it all out, follow you right back in again. And, you go eat lunch, the guy's sitting there looking in your lunchbox and seeing what you're eating, and "Hey, you want a sandwich?" Back in the office, The boss shaking his finger at you. But I left there and I started getting homesick. I wanted to smell the sagebrush again and the cottonwoods in the springtime and all that fuzz they put out and everything. And then I came home and courted my girlfriend and got married. And then I went to work for General Electric in 1960. I had 2 boys and a girl. was moved into Richland at that time, and then moved back to Benton City, and which was my home. I'd been there all my life.
How long did you live in Richland for?
Probably 2 years.
And where did you live in Richland?
Marshall Street. Don't remember the exact address, but it was on Marshall. You come in on Van Giesen and moved from there, rented a place there, and then moved to Benton City and bought a home and raised the kids up, got them up through high school. They graduated there. Then, like I say, I went to Montana for almost 3 years, and then back home for Battelle.
And what did your wife do when you worked at Hanford?
She just a homemaker. She worked at grocery store, checker. And we got a divorce in, imagine that. Can't even remember the kids all got married. They had kids. Then I remarried, and wife is a registered nurse. Works here at Life Care Center in Richland.
Okay.
Very talented person. And she will come home and tell me strange stories that happens there, like this one fellow was in this motorized scooter, and he was just dying for a cigarette. Nobody'd give him a cigarette, so he got in his motorized scooter and he escaped out the door. He went down to the corner to 7-Eleven store and bought him a pack of cigarettes. Now this guy's on oxygen. And he come back and he lit up. My wife Christine, she heard, "My goodness, that man's on fire." And she said, they all rushed out the door. And the guy's on fire. They got the fire out. It melted the plastic right into his face. And she says, every time I look at him, I can hear that man's on fire. And he's still there. But then they have, she says that one person in particular keeps calling the Richland police and telling them that, hey, they kidnapped me. They're holding me against my will. And she says the police should show up with their hands on their guns. She said, I just put my hands up. It's a false alarm. About the third time he calls, they'll come back and say, well, take his phone away from him. Some of the funny things that happen in life.
So when you worked for, what did you do when you worked for GE and Douglas United?
We were metal handlers, and which meant they were canning up 6 and 8-inch uranium slugs for the reactors. And a metal handler, all he did was you stand in front of this hydraulic machine that the metal carrier, after they got to dip those things in the hot aluminum and silicon inside of an aluminum can, then the guy had a pair of tongs, and he'd come over and he'd put them in these 2 baskets, and the baskets would drop into the water, come up, and drop again. And then the basket would turn towards you, and my job was you pulled the slugs out, and they had a metal container around them. You had to scrape the aluminum and silicone off the metal can, and then you took out the uranium slug that was clad in aluminum and put it in a pallet. And the process went on like that all day long. Then I moved back to final inspection, and what you were sitting in the lights were so bright in this cubicle we had, and you would look at the welds. They had to weld the end caps on these slugs, and you had to look for pinholes and voids. And then I did that for a year or so, and then I went to final inspection, which we were radiographing, X-raying the slugs for voids and stuff. And beside the station there where we were radiographing these slugs, there were about 30 autoclaves. Just they stood up about this high above the metal floor. There's a 200-pound hydraulic door that closed on those autoclaves, and what they would do, they would load 60 of these slugs, these uranium slugs, in a basket. And they had little round cylinders in there. You put the slug in so they wouldn't bump against each other. You'd put 60 in the basket, and they'd get an array of 6 baskets, which are 240 slugs. They all had a hole in the basket through the center. They'd load this, they would put this big steel rod down through the baskets, and they'd put a pin in the bottom, and the crane would come overhead and pick that whole stack up and lower it down into the autoclave. And then the operator would give the signal, close the door. Then he had a pipe. There was a handle sticking out. He had a pipe he'd stick in there, a big cheater bar, and he would pull that door shut, and the locking dogs would all come out and lock the lid on there. Now, on the end of that pipe on the door, there was a round hole, and underneath of it was a hydraulic device that had a pin in it, and the pin had to come up and go through that hole in the handle before he could ever bring it up on pressure. And he's looking at his control panel. Okay, this one's okay. I'm going to bring it up on tremendous pressure, steam pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And we were radiographing our slugs, me and this other employee. Pretty soon the floor started shaking. What? Earthquake? What? And then we seen the operator. He got up and he started walking over towards this one autoclave. And his head come up, and he looked like a giraffe. He looked like his head was this high above his body. He looked, and he just turned and started to run because he could see that door on that autoclave shuddering, and that pin had just barely touched the edge of that hole, and it gave him the signal that the door was locked, which it was not. And that thing just worked that door around until it got past the locking lugs. The hinge pin on that 200-pound door was 2-inch solid steel. It snapped that like a toothpick. It blew the lid off and blew it up through the roof and stuck it right in the monorail, the crane rail, and just bent it in a big U and stuck right there. The steam pressure on that started firing those baskets and those uranium slugs. It was just like a cannon barrel. Zoom, boy. Me and this other fellow dove under the steel table, and the workers that were on the outside of the building, they said they seen those baskets and those slugs go 80 feet above the building, and then they came back down through the roof, back down on us. And these things were hitting, dropping all around us. And, of course, me and him were under the table, and people scattered. It just happened to be this was right at shift change. The other crew was coming in. We was getting ready to leave, and right in the middle, that thing went through the roof. And what was after the slugs kept raining down, after they stopped, me and that fellow underneath there was on our hands and knees, and we started laughing, just giggling insanely, because you could hear these things hitting above you on that table, pa-dink, pa-dink, And then the criticality alarm went off, and that wasn't funny. We thought, uh-oh, one of those slugs ruptured, and we're all crapped up, and that's what they crapped up as. And then they told us that was a false alarm, which seemed kind of strange, a criticality alarm going off. But the bad thing about working back then for General Electric and Douglas United Nuclear was they picked 6 or 8 of us. I think there were 8 of us. And they took us out of the 313 building where we were canning slugs up, and they took us over in this Butler building, they called them, kind of a tin shack, and went in there and all this fancy equipment in there and a great big long open front hood. What are we doing here? We had a supervisor. His name was Paul Rhodes. They called him Dusty Rhodes. And he said, "You guys have been picked for guinea pigs." Oh, yeah, what's new? They had designed a process to can up thorium. And thorium is a white powder. It's just like flour, like a sandy flour. And it was for the atomic subs. And they used that on the front face of the reactor in the sub as a biological shield, because thorium oxide is not radiation-wise as hot as uranium slugs.
But they were the fuel element.
Fuel element. Yeah.
Okay, but
Yeah.
they were safe
Instead of
for-
uranium, it was thorium.
Okay.
Instead of a uranium slug, it was a thorium oxide. And thorium oxide is a bone seeker. Cancer of the bones and stuff. Once, when we first started out, and we're working in this open-faced hood, and we're pounding this stuff in a can. It's a rod about this big around with a flat on top, and it comes down a conveyor belt to you. The scale is weighing it out, an electronic scale, and these are in little tin cylinders. And you take it, and you got a funnel thing here, and you put the aluminum can in and lock it down, pour the thorium oxide into the can, and then pound it in there. You had a mark on that tampon bar that you had to put it down, get it to that mark, or else it'd cause a variation in the quantity that was in there. You had to put it all in, or no go. And there were 6 of us pounding that stuff into those cans. Now you had a pair of white coveralls on, you had your surgeon gloves on, taped at the wrist, and you had a leather glove. No respirator, no anything. The glass came down about nose high, and you were working with that stuff, and it was just a white fog in front of you. Now, when they'd blow the whistle for you to go to lunch, what we would do was that powder would be all the way up to your elbows. You could see it on your coveralls. You would brush your coveralls off, and then you would take the leather gloves off, and then you would take the tape off and leave your surgeon gloves inside there, in trash. And then we would all come out of there and walk over to the step-off pad, and all 6 of us are getting out of our coveralls, and I thought, man, that stuff's got to be going airborne, And then we'd take the Syntran and run over it. We're okay, no bad stuff on us. And they would take us down when we first started out once every 2 weeks to the whole body counter, and they'd scan us from head to foot. And then it got to be once a month, and then once every 2 months. And they pulled me out there and they said, "You eat a lot of fish?" "No." "Why?" I said, "You've got a high zinc content in you." And I didn't think much of it at the time. But I got my dose reconstruction back here 2012. I was contaminated with thorium oxide, which turns into some exotic thing, so they say. And they had the audacity to tell me that I picked it up during the 1960s, during atomic testing. And it just happened to be thorium oxide. But anyway, I turned the claim in, which was denied. But for the other 3 cancers, I got compensated for that. 2 basal cell carcinomas and one other cancer that is pretty common in a male, prostate cancer. and they compensated me for that, which it doesn't make up for your health. Now I just got examined the second. In fact, the Cold War Patriots, which I'm very proud of to be a member of, they found the asbestos in my lungs when they give me every 3 years you're allowed a complete physical. Mm-hmm. And they go over you from head to foot, and they picked up the asbestos in my lungs.
Wow.
And then the second, they told me because of that I have COPD, and lung capacity is at half, which makes it hard to do anything. I went to Cancun, my wife and I on vacation, and they got a 1.5 mile zip line there, 1.7 miles. And of course the towers, at different towers, you got to get it took me a half hour to get up to the top of the tower, you know, and you run out of steam before you get there. It's been an interesting life. It's been an interesting career. While we were in canning up thorium oxide, they were all plywood walls, and they had that it was like crepe paper insulation back in those days when they built those back in the 40s, 2s and 3s. And sitting there, I happened to look over at the wall, and they had painted the wall with a white epoxy paint. And I got to looking at the wall, and man, that thing's blowing bubbles. I told the guy, hey, look at that. And he looked over and he said, how come that wall's bubbling? I don't know. So we come out of the hood, got cleaned up, went over there, was looking at the wall, and the epoxy it'd blow a bubble and then pop, you know, and what's going on here? Well, little did we know, there was a welder on the outside of that tin building, and he was welding us up some gas manifold pipes, and he set that insulation on fire, and we had a big exhaust fan up in the attic, and it was whipping that up, and that flames up through there, and it was blistering that plywood epoxy paint. Wow. And the boss come over and said, what are you guys doing? Get over and get to work. And he said, what are you doing? I said, well, we're looking at the wall here. He's looking, and he said, how come that's bubbling? He says, do you see any smoke? He said, no. And they'd patch the plywood with you've probably seen it, little square there, a diamond-shaped thing in the plywood where they've patched a hole in. One of them popped out, and he looked and he said, uh-oh, I see some fire. Now, you guys just stay here. And he went and locked the door. He stepped out and locked us in there, and then he pointed to the back, which there was a step-off pad out back, a concrete area they had roped off. We could go out there and stand. And here come the fire truck. He missed the place. He backed up and come. And there this guy's still welding. He don't know he set the building on fire. And they chopped a hole in it and put the fire out. Boss sent us to lunch. We come back, never missed a lick. Just went right back to work again.
Wow.
That was kind of sad. One of the sad things is I was watching the TV, and they detonated the smokestack out at 100F. Mm-hmm. And that guy, I thought, man, that was right beside the building we were working in, you know.
Do you remember any Navy officials ever coming to inspect the process you were working on?
Navy?
Yeah, because you said you were making these slugs for the nuclear submarine.
Yeah, and we didn't know that until after we got we did 2 different sessions over there, 2 different years. Never seen any Navy personnel. Of course, you know, we were just the employees, you know, and not privy to that. But with Battelle, that was different. When the sponsor, NCI or any of the dignitaries from the companies that we had to contract to us, they would all come and talk to us. And I can remember we got called in the office. A good friend of mine that worked there with me, his name was Gary L. And the sponsor, and he was the head hog. I mean, over everything. He was in the change room with us, and when we'd first seen him about a year before that, he was huge. He was a very large man, almost obese. And when he come the second time, I swear he must have lost 200 pounds because he looked normal, you know. And he was in the change room with Gary and I, and we were suiting up and getting ready to go into one of the sterile zones. And Gary said, I bet I know what... Well, first, the sponsor said, hey, what do you think, guys? I lost about 200 pounds, you know. Yeah. Gary said, you know what? This guy's name was Joe. He said, I bet I know what Joe's thinking about right now. I said, what? I said, I bet he's thinking about a big chocolate milkshake. You know, the guy had some choice words for us, and next thing you know, there we sitting in the boss's office, and he's shaking his finger at us, you know. But if you couldn't put some humor into the situations we were in, it wasn't worth being there.
Right.
But it's been very rewarding for me, all except like I say, back then they didn't know what asbestos, you know, the danger of that, and potential carcinogens.
Right.
But it's been very rewarding.
Were you working on site, or do you remember when they started to bring the spent nuclear, the submarine reactors back to be
No.
buried on site?
We had we had nothing to do with that whatsoever. You know, we were just making the fuel for them, and we weren't privy to any of what happened afterwards.
Okay.
But we didn't know that was for the atomic subs until it was quite a while after they finally told us that, hey, you're canning up fuel for the atomic subs.
Kind of interesting, though, to think that you canned that fuel, and then now Hanford is the repository for all of the spent reactors, that they cut them up and bury them in the same place.
A friend of mine, he just retired. He was working out there for C.H. Hill and a bunch of contractors. His job was to go sample the burial grounds after they dig them up, and he had a lot of interesting stories to tell about that. One thing that this was during the 60s. If you recall, in the paper, Hanford put out a news blurb about any of the duck hunters. They were checking thyroids on ducks, and they wanted you to bring your duck heads in, their neck and their head, so they could check them. And they come up with some strange reason why they were doing this. Well, a friend of ours, he brought this big old mallard duck in. That thing was so hot, he ought not have been anywhere near that thing. They grabbed him and scrubbed him down until my skin was bleeding. Those ducks were going out to the cooling ponds out in the area, which they weren't screened over at that time. And, you know, ducks were dabbling down the bottom, picking up strontium-90 and all these radioactive elements. And then that guy's got that duck in his hand, you know, and they put the Centran up there, and that thing went nuts, you know, and they scrambled and suited up, and they never did come out with why they were doing that until later on. It finally came out that those ducks had, you know, they see a big pond out there, they go out there and dabble around in it and get crapped up, you know.
And when did they finally start screening those? Do you remember?
Oh, no, it was they had them all screened over by probably by 75, as I recall, in about that time. But that friend of mine said, "Boy, they scrubbed me until I was bleeding."
So
they went to his home also.
Oh, wow.
And they tore up the carpets, furniture, everything. I guess he'd come in the house, "Hey, look at this duck I got you."
Right. Right. So later, when you worked for Battelle, you said that you had you'd done that animal testing, and you had introduced animals to nickel oxide and cobalt oxide. And so why those two chemicals. Were those used at Hanford, or did those have other applications?
Other applications, commercial. Uh, most of the testing was manufacturing type applications, like the asbestos concrete exposure that I was on.
Mm-hmm.
That was the sawdust off of transite pipes. When the craftsman would saw the pipes to length, he's inhaling that transite pipe dust, and he don't know there's asbestos in it. And most of in fact, all of the contracts we got were to test where there were potential carcinogens.
Wow, that's really, so when you were doing cigarettes, then was it when you were doing those, was it known that they were? I mean, obviously most people like knew, but was it a stated fact federally, or did
Not at that time,
your
no.
research help lead to that?
Yeah, we got that contract from the National Cancer Institute, and later on, for Battelle, they did it was Liggett and Myers. They were doing a cigarette exposure, which was very hush-hush. Nobody would tell you a thing about what on in that room. Even the technician was sworn to silence because of the manufacture of that product, not because there was anything sneaky going on, but they didn't want to get out before they finished the study. And also exposed them to diesel exhaust smoke.
Oh.
We went over to Kennewick one time, right there on the main street. We set up a air sampler on all four corners. The asbestos content in the air was higher than it was in Johns Mansfield, where they're putting these asbestos bats together for insulation for homes. Wow. The reason for that, it was coming off the brake drums. There was asbestos in the brake drum, and the cars going by kept that stuff fanned up. You walk down the street, you're taking on asbestos.
Wow.
And then we went to all the food stores around and bought different liver: hog liver, beef liver, chicken liver. They ashed that down and went through the chemical analysis of it. I would never, ever, I never liked it anyway, but I would never, ever eat liver. There was stibesterols, growth inhibitors, hormones, heavy metal. No liver for me. But that all these things they've been pumping in all these animals and these feedlots and everything, stibesterols and growth stimulators and the hormones left a residue in the liver, which is the collecting point of everything you filter. And then people are eating that and they're ingesting it. It's sticking with you.
Yeah. Wow. Were you working on site when JFK visited in 1963? Did you go to the dedication of the N reactor?
Yes, I went out to see him. Yeah.
What do you remember about that?
I can remember him saying, "Boy, you have a hot country here," and he was pulling on his, But that was a thrill to see the helicopters. There he comes, and they said, "No, that's a decoy," and they finally came in and landed, and it was just blistering hot that day, and people were passing out in the crowd. You couldn't see the ground for the people. I mean, there was hundreds out there, and it was very hot. But that was kind of a thrilling thing to see the president. Big to do about it, of course.
Were there any other events or incidents that happened at Hanford while you were working there or at Battelle that stand out to you, besides the couple explosions you mentioned?
Just minor humorous things that happened. One time they brought all these Japanese dignitaries. Now our aerosol physicist was named Douglas K. Craig, and he was a very proper person. And he called me an illiterate savage. But that was early on in my career when I hired in. He was I worked for the doctor, the German, and Douglas K. Craig was the aerosol physicist. The doctor got the contract. The aerosol physicist was responsible for the outcome and the design and everything. And me being an old country kid at that time, his speech and his manner and being so stiff and prim and proper, and kind of made me chuckle. But I proved him wrong a couple of times. And he would say, "But that cannot be. That cannot be." Well, it is. Anyway, I endeared myself to him by just using common sense. And he and I got to be, he'd come and ask me, he'd say, "How would you do this?" And I found out I had and all it was common sense, an uncanny knack of figuring out how to generate all these exotic chemicals we were using. The one thing I do remember, before the asbestos exposure ever started, they had this huge cylinder, and it was had this tube with a plunger in the bottom, and they'd put the asbestos in there and screw it in the bottom of this big column, and they had air jets going in, and it would suck the asbestos. You had to maintain the concentration within 10% for 6 hours, which there went the asbestos in the chamber. And so the engineers, aerosol physicists, they worked on this thing for months. We were about ready to lose the contract. And they finally gave up on it. And I asked them, I said, "Hey, what are you going to do with that generator?" And they said, "Well, we're going to junk it, bury it. Can I play with that thing?" And, yeah, sure, Mr. Einstein, go ahead. Time I got done, that asbestos generator was this tall. And by chance, I found out you had to pack that stuff into the tube and tamp it down, and 13 grams in exactly 7 inches. And I turned that thing on, and I couldn't find an aggregate the air jets wouldn't. I didn't want the air jets to blow in there and send that stuff out. I tried pieces of gravel, and I tried little kids' jacks. I cut them up and put them in there and this stuff there, and rattle it around, on top of that asbestos, and everything got dull. I even took some screws and cut them in half and dropped in there. Anyway, I was sitting there one day and I thought, boy, you're a dummy if you can't figure this out. And they had a bunch of crucibles in the lids sitting on the shelf there. And I thought, ceramic. I wonder. So I took a crucible lid and put it in a paper towel and took a hammer and beat it up. And I took those pieces and I looked and I said, well, that one looks about right. And I picked out 4 of them and I dropped in that tube, and that stuff started rattling around. They never did get dull. And the first, we were shooting for 24 micrograms per liter. And the first sample I took was 23.9. And I thought, wow. So I got a hold of the aerosol physicist, and he come over. And I had all my data. I'd been taking samples of that all day long. And he come over and he said, what is this? No, that can't be. Yeah, it can be. I said, an illiterate savage like me, I've got enough brains to figure this out. You know that? Dr. Duggar. Anyway, we got the contract, and he would walk around me and look at me, and he said, but you have no education, Yeah, well, all mine come from common sense. And that would infuriate him. But went up to his office one day. My fellow technician, and he had a rock as a paperweight there, and it was kind of a U-shaped rock. And I said, Doug, he said, you'll address me as Dr. Douglas K. Craig. Doctor will be fine. That's okay. Duggar, where'd you get that rock? And I laid some of this hillbilly stuff on him, and he said, why? I said, you know what? Where'd you get that? And he said, well, I walked down the river one day. I said, my gosh, don't you agree? And my partner, he said, oh yeah, he went right along with me, you know. He said, why? What? I said, do you know what that is? That's a left-handed Indian throwing rock. He said, what? Oh my, an artifact? And I said, yeah. See how it fits your hand? I said, the Indians throw it and knock them jackrabbits over. And he said, oh my. And he took it away from me. He was looking at it. And he put it there and said, well, I will cherish that artifact. And he was talking to himself. About that time, the other scientists come in. He knew we were a couple of jokers. And he come in, and his name was John Ballou. And John heard what we were doing, and when we come out of the office, he said, you better hope he never finds out. That's just a rock, you know. And we thought, my goodness, maybe we ought not played that joke on him. But then Dr. Douglas K. Craig and I ended up being good friends. He moved down to California and went to work for another research outfit, and he would call me up. And he'd say, Edward, my friend. And when he'd start that, I knew he wanted to know something. And when I got the device on my patent, the calls were coming in from all over the world, foreign companies, research outfits, because the device they had on the market was a right dust feed mill, and it was a very unstable way of generating any kind of particulate or solids, and it'd break down, and very poor performance on them. And when I made that device, all you had to do is pour the powder in, 2 working parts, 2 bottle brushes. One spirally wound like an auger, the other one was a flexible brush, and it was just in you pour they had a lucite. I made it on my kitchen table one night, and about a year later, after I got the patent on it, I checked in to see what they were selling. The Battelle Development Corporation made a nice design and stainless steel and $15,000 a pop for 2 bottle brushes, and I got $1 silver for the patent and taken to supper, and that was that. So, and they're making money hand over fist off me. But a lot of everybody calling for reprints. I had to write a technical report on that, and they published it. And I didn't bring one of them copies with me, but I got calls from all over the world. Scientists wanting to know about it. I said, well, you make it yourself on your kitchen table, and there's a boss whopping me on the head. Don't tell him that. How am I going to sell it to him, you dope? But that was probably the highlight of my career, was just common sense. Now, the scientists and the doctors, 12, 13, 15 years of college education, but they don't teach them anything about common sense. And that's all I ever worked on was, being a farm kid, to have to repair your own machinery and things like that. And it wasn't hard to figure out how to endear myself to the company by just using common sense.
That's great. Just a couple more questions, I guess, until we move on to the stuff you brought, which I'm really excited to have you narrate. Do you remember do you remember any impact from large nuclear incidents on your work, like 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl? Because you would have been working for Battelle at that time. Do you remember any particular impact of those incidents on your work or on the
No,
kind of the
yeah.
attitude of the work or people here?
I remember reading it in the paper and wondering how much of that stuff was going around the world, on the air streams. Probably paying more mind to Chernobyl when it blew its stack. Now, when Mount St. Helens blew up, I was in Yakima, and I was going up and going camping, and I spent the night in Yakima. And I woke up, and I thought, oh, it's too early yet, Went back to sleep, woke up, and I thought, my goodness, did I sleep all day? It's getting dark out. And I turned the radio on, and uh-oh, and took off for home, and I just beat that dust cloud down to Benton City, and most of it went over the top of us, like ended up Moses Lake and Spokane. But we got the contract for exposing hamsters to Mount St. Helens fly ash. And if you looked under the fly ash under a microscope, it looked like it was kind of crystalline. It looked like a little kid's jack they play with, but a million spikes sticking out on the thing. It looked like a sandburr. And that stuff, when you inhale it, just cut your lungs up to pieces,
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
Wow. How did the atmosphere surrounding the Cold War affect your job or your life? Did you notice anything, or can you recall anything?
A lot of contracts from the Army. A lot of contracts. And like I say, one of them was a CS2 with a disabler in it. A lot of activity that nobody would say anything about. You say, hey, what you guys working on now? What you fellas working on now? Blank stare and walk on, you better not ask them anymore, But a lot of activity from the Army. Didn't see, I don't think I ever saw any Navy personnel. If I did, they weren't in uniform. But a lot of strange people around that time coming and going.
What about living next to Hanford and all the activity? Did you ever feel like maybe you were safe because of all of the Army attention here, or maybe you were not safe because Hanford might be a target if a war ever broke out?
I always thought about it being a target, being there were quite a number of reactors out there, and you thought, well, if they're going to hit something, it'll probably be Hanford. And never lived in any fear of it, but when they started all this downwinder stuff in the papers, contamination from Hanford, that did make me kind of wonder. It didn't make me feel ill at ease, but it just, you didn't know what you were inhaling. And you didn't know what was coming down the ground that the cows were eating, and you're drinking their milk, and then which ended up being a big deal, in later years. But my children never thought much about it either. My brothers and sisters did, and they all moved away to different places. And I told them that, hey, you can't outrun the air currents. That stuff's coming down all over, especially during the atomic testing when they're, the ones they sent me to, Battelle sent me to University of Davis, and to represent them. I had only worked there about a year and a half, 2 years maybe at the most. They sent me down there, and little did I know they they sprung me as their guest speaker, and I didn't know anything about it. A boss of mine set that up, and I thought, my goodness, what in the world am I going to talk about? And I thought, you got to put some humor in this thing, because I'm shaking, I'm young and dumb, and I was, whoo, and all these people sitting there watching me, all the dignitaries, and I said, well, we're doing research with hamsters. And most of these were all hamster people. It was a big hamster research convention there. I said, the first thing you have to do is, you all know, you got to get him loose from your finger. And then those are the bitingest animals in the world. Everybody thinks they're so sweet and cuddly until he latches onto your finger. And I can remember when we were making them, introducing them to cigarette smoke. Of course, they had the smoking dogs out there too, which were famous, every time they mentioned. And those dogs were addicted. They'd fight you for a cigarette. I mean, you'd open the cage and they'd jump right in your arm, go over and stick their head in the mask, put the cigarette in, light it up, boys. But I can remember many times those hamsters latching on and locking their jaws up and biting you right through the fingernail, right to the bone. You'd have to take the handle on a pair of tweezers and stick in there and jack his jaw when you get your finger back out, And and I probably, if the boss knew this, he'd kill me. We had this one particular hamster. He didn't bite you. I mean, he'd go after you and he'd bite you every time you. Most of them, they'd bite you once and let it go at that, But this one, he'd bite you every time you got near him, and he'd just defy you. Pick me up, I'm going to bite you. Well, me and my partner said, what do you think? Well, I'm tired of him biting him. I hope he'd die pretty soon. Maybe he'll die, He wouldn't die. So we grabbed him one day and got him by the scruff of the neck, and we took the side cutter and cut his teeth off. And after that, he'd chomp down on you and say, hey, go ahead and bite, Well, for the rest of his life, we had to soften up his food and feed him so he wouldn't die. We couldn't bite you, but we said, maybe we ought not done that. Those hamsters would actually, the asbestos hamsters were the only ones that would do this. Their water nipple hung above their head, and then you had a big water tree you'd put on the cage, and that's how they got their water. They'd take their finger and stick in that water nipple and sit in there and let the water run on them, and we'd sit there and watch through the window. And of course, they'd make a terrible mess because we had them on these racks, and we had absorbent pads underneath them. In the morning when we'd take them out, we'd have to roll that pad up and put it in the garbage. Well, they just flood that thing. Their tray had a lip around it, and it was an awful mess to clean up. So we got to watch them. We'd look through the window at night, and there they are. They're taking their finger and sticking in that water nozzle and letting the water come down in, and they're showering and shampooing and shaving, and we'd go in there and quit that. And they'd all quit. The minute we'd leave, they're back up there with their finger in that water nipple taking a shower.
It was only the asbestos ones?
Only the asbestos animals did that.
Interesting. Do you think that was maybe like some kind of neurological?
I think it was the fibers tickling them and itching them, because that stuff was all over them,
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have minor clarification. When you worked at Battelle, what was your job position exactly?
Started hired in just as for Battelle, it was just technician.
Technician. Because you went from being a metal handler to...
Yeah, from General Electric, they called us a metal handler.
Mm-hmm.
And then they made me the inhalation specialist. Mm-hmm. And then things kind of slowed down, so they kind of got demoted back to a technician again, and that's when we went into the control rooms, and each of us had a assigned control room that we ran, and many different chemicals that go through them control rooms that we were generating. Everything potential carcinogen. I like that word, potential carcinogen. Formaldehyde, and that's some bad stuff too.
So, should we do the pictures?
Except the U.S. Patent Office, which has awarded a patent to the Department of Energy for a device that will deliver uniform concentrations of dust for a long period of time. It was developed by Edward Milliman at the Pacific Northwest Laboratories, operated for DOE by Battelle Memorial Institute. People, however, need have no fear, as the dust is used in research to test potential health effects of dust compounds when inhaled into the lungs of laboratory animals. Some of the tested dust have been talc powder, CS2, Mount St. Helens fly ash. The prototype of the unit cost is about $50, and the number is 4424869. If anyone cares.
And so this was the device you vetted that then they were selling for
Yeah,
$15,000.
15,000.
I mean, take some small.
Yeah. Now this is how you make a hamster smoke cigarettes.
And that's you right there,
That's
right?
me, 1970. Boy, I had a lot of hair. There's 30 cigarettes in this turn, and it'll take a puff off of each cigarette, and then it rotates. And there's 30 hamsters in these tubes. They have no choice. The smoke goes down through this column here. They have no choice.
I forgot to ask you, did you ever smoke cigarettes?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
After we took the lungs out of these animals, I threw the cigarettes in the garbage can, never smoked since.
Wow.
This is one of the exposure chambers. This is where they, each rat.
In a second, we're getting quite a bit of glare.
Okay.
Can hold it from the top, or see if I can hold it flat. Or... There we go.
There we go. That was good.
This is the exposure chamber designed by Patel. Your rats, mice, hamsters are all individual in each compartment, and I think it'll hold a couple hundred critters. And whatever you're going to make them inhale comes down a pipe and goes into the top, and it's exhausted out the bottom. And the doors are glass, so you can watch and observe the animal.
Wow.
Is this just for smoking, the cigarette smoke, or was this?
No, any kind of chemical,
Any kind of chemical.
vapors, dust, any kind of compound.
It's a smoker.
Just smoking, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what I was thinking.
And that's how you that's how you load a hamster into a smoking tube after you get him off your finger. Now you can see here there's one. He's saying, "Oh, I'm next." And was also the asbestos exposure. This is all the protection we had on, just a white paper face mask.
Wow.
And this is one guy that. This is what they do. You take them apart, all the way from his nose all the way down. Take samples, everything, make slides. Goes to histology, pathology. This is what your lungs will look like if you inhaled Mount St. Helens fly ash.
Wow. And so what is the lighter one there on the
The
on the
NEFA
right?
is nickel enriched fly ash,
Okay.
which it has a high content of nickel in it. And the one on the far right is a normal one.
Okay. Wow.
And the one in the middle is also.
That's nickel enriched fly ash. The one on the far left is just fly ash.
What was the level of exposure here to get this?
Probably 25 micrograms per liter. It is an equivalent to what a human breathes. Everything was scaled down hamster size compared to a human.
So if you just were walking around and breathing it,
Correct. Correct.
And how would that compare to, say, cigarette smoking?
Cigarette smoke is a long-term thing. Nickel
Right.
enriched fly is short-term.
Right.
That does the damage right away. There's no long period to it. Cigarette smoke, the latency period in that is years. People smoke for years.
Right. I guess like, but the damage that's done, like, is this equivalent to a certain number of years of smoking, or is
No,
it kind of a different?
This is different here.
Okay.
Your lifespan after you inhale this stuff every day compared to a cigarette is very, very short.
Right.
Cigarette, you last quite a bit longer.
Sure.
So on that, I'm just a little curious. So was that fly ash from,
Mount St. Helens.
but it's not after the explosion, because that's dated 77 and the explosion was in 82?
Well, see, they stored this stuff up, and we didn't do the exposure until after that thing blew up. Now these lungs here were probably some of the preliminary stuff, because they were testing volcanoes from around the world.
Oh, so,
And,
yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
this was just volcanic fly ash
Yeah.
as opposed to.
Oh, okay.
St. Helens.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So that explains the date.
And this was the asbestos concrete exposure. Wait a minute here, let me- Oops. Now this was probably in '78. And you can see here, they finally started figuring out that asbestos was bad for you. And compared to a white paper face mask, this,
Right. Now you have a full body. Looks like you have a respirator.
yep.
Mask.
We had rubber overshoes on, Tyvek protective clothing, respirator.
Wow.
And this just happened to be a round exposure chamber there, but these were with hamsters also.
Wow. That's great.
And we are smoking rats. We're doing the physiology on it. That's a grass machine. It's like a lie detector, and we're doing the testing on their respiratory rate, their heart rate. Everything's sterile. To get
Yeah.
to where I'm at right there, you had to shower and shave and disinfect and be fully protected. And it's to keep us from giving them a disease. It's not to protect us from the animals. It's to protect the rats and the mice and the hamsters. And here we're doing the same thing where this is when you go red, like you're on the actual exposure for the contractor.
So there were different color suits.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. And so red would be when you were directly working with with the particulates and.
Not necessarily, but that's what they wanted. So there was no difference in just other than the color of the. Everything's sterile and sanitized.
Right. Is that so that other people working would know that you
Yeah.
would be? Okay.
There was just these. Do you want to talk about those at all?
This is one of the funny things that happened to me. Girlfriend and I were over at the Black Angus in Pasco, and we were sitting in the booth, and we were eating our supper, steak and mushrooms, and having a fine time. It started getting quiet, and I'd already paid for my bill, and ordered a cup of coffee, and we were sitting there drinking coffee, and got awful quiet. So I got up, and there was nobody around. So we went to go out. I said, well, I guess everybody left. So we started to go out the door. Well, the door's locked. You can't get out. I went in the kitchen hollering, hey, let us out. Bartender gone, kitchen gone, nobody there. I got on the pay telephone and called 911. And I said, hey, we're locked in the Black Angus. I said, what? Huh? Are you playing a joke? No. We want to go home. I got to go to work tomorrow. And so, and they said, what's your phone number there? So I give them the phone number. They called the place next door, and the next door place called us. The phone rang, I picked it up. Yeah, we're here. He called back, said they're in there. And they figured what happened, we'd hid in there and was going to rob the place and couldn't get out. And so they called me back and they said, well, okay, we're coming down. I said, don't come with the police dogs and the guns and stuff and the sirens, because I got to go to work tomorrow. So here they come. We were sitting there waiting on them, and there was a little console there, and there was some kind of video machine, and she and I were trying to figure out how to play it. And all at once I told her, don't move, keep your hands on the table. She said, why? And I said, I smell a cop. And slowly both of us turned our head, and there were 3 heads peeking around the door at us. And they came in, and they all had their hands on their guns. Whoa, fellas, get your hands off that hog leg. You're making me nervous. I've been shot once. It ain't fun. So they were really questioning us. Said, how'd you get in here? Well, and they had the manager with them. And he said, did you pay for your supper? And I said, yeah, and I left a tip. And you keep on being mean to me. I want my tip back. And I kept looking to one police officer. And when I came back from Montana, I worked at the Bon Marché before they opened up. And me and him were in there as a security guard. And he was moonlighting because he was a Pasco cop. And I kept looking at him. I said, Archie, is that you? His name was Archie Pittman. And he looked, Matt, what are you doing here? I'm just eating supper. And he said, okay, guys, I know him. Let him go. So, but that come out in the paper that said they knew that businesses were hard up for patrons, but they didn't think they was going to lock them in just to keep them. And this is my old friend. I was in the Cub Scouts, I think it was, me and old Pancho.
Oh.
Old lifelong friend.
That's cute.
That's the box elder tree my brother dove behind when the
To
shooting
dodge the
started.
bullets?
Yeah, dodging the bullet.
There you go.
Great.
Well, thank you so much.